The morning mist clung to Chickamauga Creek like a burial shroud, and Major General William Stark Rosecrans felt the weight of impending doom pressing against his chest. It was September 18th, 1863, and the Union Army of the Cumberland had walked directly into the jaws of Confederate General Braxton Bragg's carefully laid trap. The Cherokee word Chickamauga meant River of Death. And on this blood-soaked morning in northwestern Georgia, the ancient name would prove devastatingly prophetic. Rosecrans had achieved remarkable success during his Tullahoma campaign that summer, outmaneuvering Bragg with tactical brilliance and forcing the Confederate Army of Tennessee to abandon Middle Tennessee with minimal Union casualties. The victory had filled the Union command with dangerous overconfidence. Now, as the first rays of dawn pierced the Georgia wilderness, Rosecrans realized his strategic triumph had led him into the greatest military disaster of his career. The Confederate trap had been months in the making. After losing Chattanooga without a fight, Bragg had received substantial reinforcements from across the Confederacy. Most significantly, Lieutenant General James Longstreet's veteran corps from Robert Edward Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had arrived by railroad, bringing with them the hard-earned experience of Gettysburg and countless Virginia battlefields. These seasoned warriors, combined with additional troops from Mississippi and the Carolinas, had swelled Bragg's army to over 66,000 men, the largest Confederate force ever assembled in the Western Theater. Rosecrans commanded approximately 58,000 troops, but his forces were dangerously scattered across the rugged terrain south of Chattanooga. The Union general had divided his army into 3 separate corps, stretching them across a 40-mile front as they pursued what he believed to be a retreating Confederate force. Major General George Henry Thomas commanded the 14th Corps, Major General Alexander McDowell McCook led the 20th Corps, and Major General Thomas Leonidas Crittenden controlled the 21st Corps. Each corps moved independently through the mountainous wilderness, connected only by treacherous mountain roads and unreliable communications. The terrain itself favored the defenders. Dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine created a labyrinth of natural barriers, while Chickamauga Creek wound through the landscape like a serpent, its steep banks and limited crossings channeling any attacking force into predictable avenues of approach. Bragg had positioned his army east of the creek, using the waterway as a natural defensive barrier while planning to strike the scattered Union forces before they could concentrate. On the evening of September 17th, Rosecrans finally grasped the magnitude of his peril. Confederate cavalry under Major General Joseph Wheeler had been probing his positions for days, reporting back the locations of his scattered corps to Bragg's headquarters. Union scouts brought increasingly alarming reports of massive Confederate troop movements, and the capture of several Confederate soldiers revealed the presence of Longstreet's corps, a development that shocked the Union High Command. According to historical documentation from the American Battlefield Trust, the Battle of Chickamauga would ultimately result in over 34,000 total casualties, making it the second bloodiest engagement of the entire Civil War. As night fell on September 17th, both armies prepared for what would become the most savage fighting the Western Theater had ever witnessed. Rosecrans spent the night frantically attempting to concentrate his scattered forces. Urgent dispatches raced through the darkness as Union commanders struggled to understand their positions and link up with neighboring units. The complicated movement of 3 corps through wilderness roads in darkness created inevitable confusion, delays, and dangerous gaps in the Union line. Meanwhile, Bragg issued his own orders for a dawn assault that would strike the Union forces before they could properly consolidate their positions. The stage was set for catastrophe. As the first light of September 18th crept across the Georgia wilderness, over 120,000 soldiers prepared for a battle that would test the limits of human courage and endurance. The River of Death was about to claim its terrible tribute. The battle erupted at dawn on September 19th, with the crack of rifle fire echoing through the misty forest like thunder. Confederate Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry had located what appeared to be an isolated Union brigade near Reed's Bridge, one of the few crossing points over Chickamauga Creek. What followed was a tragic case of mistaken identity that would ignite 2 days of unprecedented carnage. Colonel Daniel McCook's brigade of Union Mounted Infantry, part of the Reserve Corps, had been conducting reconnaissance near the bridge when Forrest's troopers spotted their movement. In the dim morning light, filtering through the canopy of ancient Georgia pines, neither side could accurately identify the enemy's strength. McCook, believing he faced only a small Confederate patrol, ordered his men to advance and clear the crossing. Forrest, convinced he had encountered the vanguard of a major Union assault, immediately requested infantry support from General Bragg. The first volleys shattered the morning stillness like breaking glass. McCook's men, dismounted and fighting as infantry, took cover behind the massive trunks of oak and chestnut trees, their Spencer repeating rifles giving them a significant advantage in the opening exchanges. The Confederate troopers, armed with an assortment of carbines and shotguns, found themselves outgunned but refused to yield the vital crossing point. Within minutes, the sound of gunfire had alerted commanders on both sides that the battle they had been preparing for had finally begun. Major General George Thomas, commanding the Union 14th Corps, immediately dispatched Brigadier General Absalom Baird's division to support McCook's beleaguered brigade. Baird's troops, consisting of veteran regiments from Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, moved through the forest with practiced efficiency despite the challenging terrain. The undergrowth was so thick that officers could barely see their own men 50 yards away, and the smoke from rifle fire created an additional layer of concealment that made coordinated movement nearly impossible. Confederate reinforcements arrived simultaneously as Brigadier General Benjamin Franklin Cheatham's division rushed toward the sound of battle. Cheatham's Tennesseans and Georgians were equally experienced, having fought through the campaigns of Stones River and Murfreesboro. As these larger forces collided near Reed's Bridge, the isolated skirmish rapidly escalated into a full-scale engagement involving thousands of troops on both sides. The fighting quickly took on a savage character that would define the entire battle. The dense forest negated most advantages of artillery and cavalry, reducing the conflict to a deadly infantry duel fought at close quarters. Soldiers found themselves engaging enemies they could barely see through the smoke and foliage, with muzzle flashes providing the primary targets in the dim forest light. The distinctive crack of rifle fire merged into a continuous roar that could be heard for miles, drawing more units into the expanding maelstrom. By mid-morning, both armies were feeding additional divisions into the growing battle. Union Major General Richard Johnson's division joined Baird's men, while Confederate Major General Alexander Stewart's division reinforced Cheatham's hard-pressed troops. The battle line began to extend both north and south as commanders on both sides attempted to outflank their opponents, creating a deadly game of escalation that would eventually involve nearly every unit in both armies. The forest itself became a participant in the battle, with ancient trees serving as natural breastworks and their massive roots creating impromptu trenches. Soldiers took cover behind fallen logs that had lain in the forest for decades, while the thick canopy above filtered the sunlight into an eerie green twilight that gave the battlefield an otherworldly appearance. The undergrowth was so dense that wounded men often disappeared from sight within yards of their comrades, their cries for help echoing through the woods long after they had fallen. As the morning progressed, it became clear that neither side possessed a decisive advantage. The Union forces held their ground tenaciously, their superior rifles giving them an edge in the individual firefights that characterized forest combat. However, the Confederates possessed superior knowledge of the local terrain and benefited from interior lines that allowed them to shift reinforcements more quickly to threatened points. The result was a grinding battle of attrition that consumed men and ammunition at an alarming rate while producing little tactical gain for either side. By noon, the battle had spread along a front of nearly 4 miles, with neither army able to achieve the decisive breakthrough their commanders desperately sought. The river of death had begun to flow in earnest, and the worst was yet to come. The afternoon of September 19th transformed Chickamauga from a large skirmish into a full-scale battle of unprecedented ferocity. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, both armies poured additional divisions into the expanding combat zone. What had begun as an encounter battle near Reed's Bridge was rapidly evolving into the largest engagement ever fought in the Western Theater, with over 100,000 soldiers converging on the blood-soaked forests of northwestern Georgia. General Braxton Bragg, commanding the Confederate Army of Tennessee from his headquarters near Thedford's Ford, recognized that the morning's fighting presented him with an unexpected opportunity. His original plan had called for a coordinated assault on the scattered Union forces, but the spontaneous battle developing around Reed's Bridge was drawing in Union reserves and creating the concentrated target he had hoped to achieve through maneuver. Bragg immediately ordered his remaining divisions to converge on the battle site, transforming the accidental engagement into the decisive confrontation he had been seeking. Union Major General William Rosecrans faced a commander's worst nightmare as reports flooded into his headquarters at the Widow Glenn's house. His carefully planned concentration of forces was being disrupted by a battle that had begun without his authorization, and he found himself reacting to Confederate initiatives rather than implementing his own strategy. The sound of gunfire from the north indicated that Thomas's 14th Corps was heavily engaged, but communication with his scattered units remained sporadic due to the difficult terrain and the chaos of unexpected combat. The forest itself seemed to conspire against both armies as the battle expanded. Dense thickets of mountain laurel and rhododendron created natural barriers that channeled attacking forces into killing zones, while the thick canopy overhead prevented effective artillery observation and reduced the effectiveness of long-range fire. Soldiers found themselves fighting in a green twilight world where visibility was measured in yards rather than miles, and where the crack of breaking branches often provided the first warning of an enemy assault. Confederate Major General John Bell Hood's division, recently arrived from Virginia as part of Longstreet's Corps, entered the battle with the confidence of veterans who had fought at Gettysburg and Second Manassas. These troops brought with them a level of tactical experience that exceeded most units in the Western Theater, and their arrival significantly enhanced Confederate capabilities. Hood's Texans and Alabamians attacked with a ferocity that surprised even the battle-hardened Union defenders, who had grown accustomed to the less aggressive tactics typical of Western theater combat. The Union response came in the form of Major General John Palmer's division from Crittenden's 21st Corps, supported by portions of Major General Thomas Wood's division. These troops, primarily from Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, possessed their own combat experience from campaigns at Stones River and the Tullahoma operations. However, they found themselves facing an enemy whose tactical sophistication and aggressive spirit exceeded their previous opponents in the Western armies. As the afternoon wore on, the battle assumed a horrific rhythm of assault and counter-assault that left both sides bleeding heavily without achieving decisive results. Confederate attacks would surge forward through the forest, overrunning advanced Union positions and creating momentary breakthroughs that seemed to promise victory. However, Union reserves would inevitably appear from the woods to plug gaps in the line, launching desperate counterattacks that restored the original positions at enormous cost in casualties. The psychological effect of forest combat intensified the battle's savagery. Soldiers could rarely see more than a few dozen yards in any direction, creating a sense of isolation and vulnerability that traditional open-field combat did not produce. The constant crack of rifle fire from unseen enemies, combined with the screams of wounded men lost in the undergrowth, created an atmosphere of terror that tested even veteran troops. Units would advance confidently through seemingly empty forest only to find themselves surrounded by hidden enemies, while defensive positions that appeared secure could be outflanked by attackers moving through unobserved ravines and thickets. The casualty toll mounted with shocking rapidity as both armies fed more troops into the expanding battle. Field hospitals quickly overflowed with wounded soldiers, many of whom had been shot by enemies they never saw. The dense forest made evacuation of casualties extremely difficult, and wounded men often lay for hours within earshot of continuing combat, their cries adding to the psychological pressure on their still-fighting comrades. By evening of the 19th, neither army had achieved its objectives, but both had paid a terrible price for the day's fighting. The stage was set for an even more devastating confrontation on the following day. The dawn of September 20th brought an ominous quiet to the Chickamauga battlefield, broken only by the groans of wounded men scattered throughout the forest and the distant sound of axes as both armies worked frantically to improve their positions. During the night, both commanders had reorganized their forces and developed new plans for what they knew would be a decisive day of fighting. The Confederate Army of Tennessee had been reorganized into two wings. Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk commanding the right wing and Lieutenant General James Longstreet taking charge of the left. This command structure would prove critical to the day's events. General Braxton Bragg's battle plan called for a coordinated assault beginning on his right flank and rolling southward along the entire Confederate line. Polk's wing would initiate the attack at dawn, striking the Union left flank commanded by Major General George Thomas. Once Polk's assault had drawn Union reserves northward, Longstreet's wing would launch a massive attack against what Bragg hoped would be a weakened Union center and right flank. The plan was sound in theory, but it required precise timing and coordination that had previously eluded Confederate forces in the Western theater. The Union Army of the Cumberland had spent the night desperately trying to concentrate its scattered forces and establish a coherent defensive line. Major General William Rosecrans had positioned Thomas's 14th Corps on the left, anchored on Kelly Field, and extending northward toward the Lafayette Road. Major General Alexander McCook's 20th Corps held the center, while Major General Thomas Crittenden's 21st Corps defended the right flank near the Widow Glenn's house. However, the rapid deployment in darkness had created gaps and overlapping fields of responsibility that would prove catastrophic when tested by Confederate assault. Polk's attack began at approximately 9:30 in the morning, nearly 5 hours behind Bragg's intended schedule. The delay had been caused by confusion in the Confederate command structure and difficulties in coordinating movements through the dense forest. When the assault finally commenced, it struck Thomas's corps with devastating effect. Confederate divisions under Major General Benjamin Cheatham and Brigadier General St. John Little crashed into Union positions along Kelly Field, beginning a savage firefight that would rage for hours without decisive result. The sound of heavy fighting on the Union left prompted Rosecrans to begin shifting reserves northward to support Thomas, exactly as Bragg had anticipated. However, the Confederate commander's plan began to unravel due to the same communication difficulties that had delayed Polk's initial assault. Longstreet, commanding the Confederate left wing, received contradictory orders about the timing of his attack and was forced to await clarification while precious time slipped away. The critical moment came at approximately 11 o'clock when a staff officer delivered a message to Rosecrans reporting a gap in the Union line between the divisions of Brigadier General Thomas Wood and Major General John Reynolds. Acting on this information, Rosecrans ordered Wood to close up on Reynolds and plug the apparent gap. However, the staff officer had been mistaken. No gap actually existed, and Wood's division was already properly positioned in line with its neighbors. Wood faced an impossible dilemma. His military training demanded absolute obedience to orders from his commanding general, but moving his division would create the very gap that the order was supposedly designed to eliminate. After brief hesitation, Wood chose to obey orders and began withdrawing his division from its positions. The movement created a quarter-mile gap in the Union center, just as Longstreet's 15,000 Confederate veterans prepared to launch their assault. Historical records from the National Park Service indicate that the timing of Wood's movement and Longstreet's attack was purely coincidental, but the result was one of the most devastating tactical disasters in American military history. Longstreet's assault, spearheaded by Hood's division and supported by the divisions of Major General Lafayette McLaws and Brigadier General Jerome Robertson, struck the Union center with the force of an avalanche. The Confederate attack achieved complete surprise. Union soldiers who had been preparing for a routine movement suddenly found themselves facing a massive enemy assault with no defensive positions and no organized resistance. Entire regiments dissolved under the impact of the Confederate charge, their soldiers streaming rearward in panic as Longstreet's veterans exploited the gap with ruthless efficiency. The Union right flank, commanded by Crittenden, collapsed almost immediately as Confederate forces rolled up the line from the gap created by Wood's withdrawal. McCook's corps, already weakened by the previous day's fighting, found itself outflanked and began a disorganized retreat toward Chattanooga. Within 30 minutes, more than half of the Union Army was in full retreat, streaming northward along the roads leading back to Tennessee. Rosecrans himself was caught up in the retreat, carried along by the flood of fleeing soldiers, and convinced that his entire army had been destroyed. Along with Crittenden and McCook, the Union commander rode toward Chattanooga to organize a defense of that critical city, leaving behind thousands of soldiers who were still fighting desperately to avoid complete annihilation. The River of Death had claimed its most terrible tribute, and the Union Army of the Cumberland teetered on the brink of total destruction. While 2/3 of the Union Army of the Cumberland streamed northward in disorganized retreat, Major General George Henry Thomas and the remnants of his 14th Corps faced the full weight of the Confederate Army of Tennessee alone. Thomas, a Virginia-born career officer who had remained loyal to the Union despite his Southern heritage, would earn his immortal nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga, during the desperate hours that followed Longstreet's devastating breakthrough. The situation facing Thomas was seemingly hopeless. His corps had been engaged in heavy fighting since dawn against Polk's wing of the Confederate Army, suffering severe casualties and consuming most of its ammunition. When Longstreet's assault shattered the Union center and right flank, Thomas found his forces isolated on Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge, surrounded by victorious Confederate divisions that sensed complete victory within their grasp. Any reasonable military assessment would have called for immediate retreat to avoid the annihilation of the only remaining organized Union force on the battlefield. Instead, Thomas made the decision that would save the Union Army of the Cumberland and preserve federal control of Tennessee. Gathering the scattered remnants of several divisions, including portions of Major General Joseph Reynolds's division, Brigadier General John Brannan's division, and Colonel Ferdinand van der Veer's brigade, Thomas established a defensive perimeter on the high ground and prepared to fight to the last man. His position resembled a horseshoe, with Union troops occupying the crest of the ridge and Confederate forces attacking from 3 sides. The Confederate assault on Snodgrass Hill began immediately after Longstreet's breakthrough in the center. Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson's division, flushed with victory from overrunning the Union right flank, turned northward and struck Thomas's southern flank with overwhelming force. The attack was supported by portions of Major General Alexander Stewart's division and elements of Hood's corps, creating a Confederate force of nearly 20,000 men against Thomas's hastily assembled defensive line of fewer than 10,000. The fighting that ensued was among the most savage of the entire Civil War. Confederate attackers surged up the rocky slopes of Snodgrass Hill in successive waves, their high-pitched rebel yells echoing through the forest as they closed with desperate Union defenders who knew that retreat meant death or capture. The Union line bent under the pressure but refused to break, with individual regiments fighting until their ammunition was exhausted and then holding their positions with bayonets and clubbed rifles. The 1st Ohio Infantry, positioned on the most exposed portion of the Union line, exemplified the desperate courage that characterized Thomas's defense. The regiment had entered the battle with over 400 men, but had been reduced to fewer than 100 effectives by the morning's fighting against Polk's wing. When Johnson's Confederates struck their position, the surviving Ohioans formed a tight defensive square and held their ground despite being outnumbered 4-1. The regiment's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bassett Langdon, fell with a Confederate bullet through his chest, but continued to direct his men's fire until he collapsed from blood loss. Similar acts of heroism occurred throughout Thomas's defensive perimeter as Union soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew their sacrifice was buying time for their retreating comrades. The 21st Ohio Infantry, reduced to 60 men from its original complement of over 300, held a critical section of the ridge against repeated Confederate assaults. When their ammunition ran out, the survivors fixed bayonets and prepared for a final charge that never came, as Confederate attackers withdrew to regroup after suffering prohibitive casualties in their attempts to dislodge the stubborn defenders. Thomas's greatest advantage lay in the terrain he had chosen to defend. Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge offered excellent defensive positions, with steep approaches that channeled Confederate attacks into killing zones and rock outcroppings that provided natural breastworks. The Union defenders had also benefited from the previous night's work, having constructed rudimentary entrenchments that multiplied their defensive effectiveness despite their numerical inferiority. As the afternoon progressed, Confederate commanders became increasingly frustrated by their inability to dislodge Thomas's force. General Bragg had initially expected a quick victory that would complete the destruction of the Union Army, but Thomas's stubborn defense was allowing precious time for the retreating Federal forces to reach safety. Wave after wave of Confederate attacks broke against the Union defensive line, leaving the slopes of Snodgrass Hill carpeted with Southern casualties while the defenders held their positions with grim determination. The arrival of Major General Gordon Granger's Reserve Corps at approximately 3 o'clock provided Thomas with desperately needed reinforcements and ammunition. Granger had marched toward the sound of gunfire without orders, bringing 2 brigades that significantly strengthened the Union defensive perimeter. However, even with these reinforcements, Thomas commanded fewer than 15,000 men against a Confederate force that had swelled to over 30,000 as Bragg committed additional divisions to what he hoped would be the final assault. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when Thomas finally received orders from Rosecrans to withdraw his command to Chattanooga. The Rock of Chickamauga had held his position for over 6 hours against overwhelming odds, buying the time necessary for the Union Army to establish defensive positions around Chattanooga and preventing a Confederate victory from becoming a Union catastrophe. As darkness fell over the blood-soaked battlefield of Chickamauga on September 20, 1863, the full magnitude of the carnage became apparent to both armies. Confederate General Braxton Bragg had achieved his objective of defeating the Union Army of the Cumberland, but the cost of victory had been so severe that his ability to exploit the triumph was fatally compromised. With more than 16,000 Union and 18,000 Confederate casualties, Chickamauga reached the highest losses of any battle in the Western theater. The Confederate casualty lists read like a roll call of Southern military leadership. 10 Confederate generals had been killed or wounded, including the fiery Texan John Bell Hood, whose leg was amputated. Brigadier General Benjamin Hardin Helm, President Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law, who had chosen to fight for the Confederacy, lay dead among the Georgia pines. Brigadier General James Deschler had been decapitated by a Union cannonball while leading his brigade in assault. The loss of so many experienced officers at the brigade and regimental level created command problems that would plague the Confederate Army for months to come. The human cost extended far beyond the general officers whose names appeared in newspaper headlines. The 3rd Confederate Infantry Regiment had entered the battle with over 400 men and emerged with fewer than 60 effectives. The 20th Tennessee Infantry had been reduced from 350 men to 47 survivors. Entire companies had been eliminated, their colors lost in the dense undergrowth where their bearers had fallen. The elite Texas Brigade, pride of Hood's division, had suffered over 60% casualties during their assault on the Union center. Union losses were equally staggering despite their defensive posture during much of the fighting. The 15th Indiana Infantry had been virtually destroyed during the first day's fighting near Reed's Bridge, losing over 200 men from its complement of 360. The 9th Ohio Infantry had suffered similar losses while defending the Union left flank against Polk's repeated assaults. Colonel William Hazen's brigade alone had lost over 800 men during Thomas's desperate stand on Snodgrass Hill. The physical condition of both armies reflected the intensity of the two-day battle. Soldiers on both sides had fought with minimal food and water, sustained by adrenaline and determination alone. Many units had fired every cartridge in their possession, with some regiments reduced to throwing rocks at their enemies during the final hours of combat. The dense forest had prevented effective evacuation of wounded soldiers, leaving hundreds of injured men scattered throughout the woods where they faced death from exposure, dehydration, or blood loss. Confederate medical services, already strained by the Army's distance from major supply depots, collapsed under the burden of caring for 18,000 casualties. Field hospitals established in barns and private homes throughout the area overflowed with wounded soldiers, many of whom received no medical attention beyond basic bandaging. Confederate Surgeon General Samuel Preston Moore had warned that the Army's medical department lacked sufficient supplies for a major engagement, and the aftermath of Chickamauga confirmed his worst predictions. Union medical care was marginally better due to superior supply lines and the proximity of Chattanooga's medical facilities. But even federal resources were overwhelmed by the scale of casualties. Union Surgeon General William Hammond had revolutionized military medicine during the first 2 years of the war, but his reforms could not cope with 16,000 casualties concentrated in a small geographic area within 48 hours. Many Union wounded were evacuated to Nashville and Louisville, straining railroad resources and civilian hospitals throughout Tennessee and Kentucky. The battle's aftermath revealed the strategic limitations of Confederate victory in the Western theater. Despite achieving a tactical triumph that rivaled any Southern success of the war, Bragg's army lacked the strength to pursue and destroy the retreating Union forces. The Confederate commander had lost nearly 20% of his effective fighting force, including many of his most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. The survivors were exhausted, demoralized by their heavy losses, and short of ammunition and supplies necessary for continued operations. General Bragg's personal command style contributed to Confederate difficulties in exploiting their victory. Known for his quarrelsome nature and tendency to blame subordinates for his own failures, Bragg had alienated many of his senior officers during the campaign leading to Chickamauga. Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk openly criticized Bragg's tactical decisions, while Major General Daniel Harvey Hill questioned the Army commander's competence in official reports. This command dysfunction prevented the Confederate Army from capitalizing on Union disorganization during the critical hours following Longstreet's breakthrough. The Union Army of the Cumberland, despite its defeat, retained significant advantages that would prove decisive in subsequent operations. General Thomas's successful rearguard action had preserved the Army's organizational structure and prevented the complete destruction that Bragg had hoped to achieve. Most importantly, the Federal forces retained control of Chattanooga, the strategic railroad center that was the ultimate objective of the campaign. Union control of this vital transportation hub would prove more significant than Confederate tactical victory on the battlefield. The River of Death had exacted its terrible price from both armies, but the war would continue with consequences that neither commander could fully comprehend as they counted their dead in the Georgia wilderness. The strategic consequences of Chickamauga rippled outward from the blood-soaked forests of northwestern Georgia like stones thrown into still water, creating effects that would influence the course of the Civil War for months to come. General Braxton Bragg's tactical victory had achieved the immediate objective of defeating the Union Army of the Cumberland, but the Confederate commander proved incapable of transforming battlefield success into strategic advantage. The failure to capitalize on victory at Chickamauga would ultimately prove more costly to the Confederate cause than outright defeat might have been. Within days of the battle, the Union Army of the Cumberland had consolidated its positions around Chattanooga, establishing strong defensive lines that utilized the city's natural advantages and railroad connections. Major General William Rosecrans, despite his defeat at Chickamauga, had managed to preserve the strategic prize that had been the campaign's ultimate objective. Union control of Chattanooga's railroad junction meant that Confederate forces in the Western Theater remained divided, unable to coordinate effectively or concentrate against Federal armies in Mississippi or Tennessee. President Abraham Lincoln's response to news of the Chickamauga defeat demonstrated the Union's growing strategic maturity and resource advantages. Rather than accepting the tactical reverse as a permanent setback, Lincoln immediately ordered reinforcements from multiple theaters to restore Union strength in Tennessee. Major General Joseph Hooker's 11th and 12th Corps were transferred by railroad from the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, covering over 1,200 miles in less than 2 weeks, a logistical achievement that showcased Northern industrial and transportation superiority. The political ramifications of Chickamauga extended far beyond military considerations, affecting both Northern and Southern morale in complex ways. Confederate newspapers initially celebrated Bragg's victory as evidence that Southern arms could still achieve decisive results against superior Union forces. The Charleston Mercury proclaimed that Chickamauga proved the invincibility of Confederate soldiers when properly led, while the Richmond Examiner declared that the battle marked the beginning of the end for Lincoln's war of aggression. However, as casualty reports reached Southern communities, celebration gave way to mourning for the thousands of sons, fathers, and brothers who had paid for victory with their lives. Northern reaction to news of the defeat followed a predictable pattern of initial shock, followed by determination to avenge the reverse. The New York Times, reflecting the sentiment of many Northern newspapers, editorialized that Chickamauga demonstrated the continuing necessity for vigorous prosecution of the war until rebellion is utterly crushed. The heavy casualties suffered by Western regiments from Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois created powerful political pressure on the Lincoln administration to reinforce the Western theater and achieve decisive victory in Tennessee. The human cost of Chickamauga extended far beyond the immediate battlefield casualties, creating ripple effects throughout American society that would last for generations. The battle produced over 7,000 widows and an estimated 20,000 orphaned children, straining existing charitable organizations and creating new demands for government assistance. The federal pension system, already burdened by casualties from previous battles, faced additional pressure from Chickamauga veterans who would require lifelong medical care and financial support. Confederate society, with fewer resources and less developed social welfare systems, struggled even more severely with the battle's human aftermath. The loss of so many officers and non-commissioned officers created leadership gaps that could not be easily filled, while the destruction of entire companies and regiments eliminated military units that had been recruited from specific communities. Towns throughout Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama found themselves mourning multiple casualties from single military units, creating communal trauma that affected entire regions. The medical consequences of forced combat at Chickamauga introduced new challenges for military surgeons on both sides. The dense undergrowth and limited visibility had produced an unusually high percentage of head and chest wounds, as soldiers had been forced to aim at whatever targets presented themselves through the forest cover. Many wounds were complicated by fragments of wood and bark driven into flesh by rifle bullets, creating infections that proved resistant to available treatments. The battle also produced numerous cases of what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though Civil War physicians lacked the knowledge to properly diagnose or treat such psychological injuries. General Bragg's failure to exploit his Chickamauga victory ultimately led to his removal from command of the Army of Tennessee, completing a process of Confederate command dysfunction that had been developing throughout the Western campaigns. The Confederate government's inability to find competent Army-level commanders for the Western theater contrasted sharply with Union success in developing effective leadership at all levels. The emergence of officers like George Thomas as the Rock of Chickamauga demonstrated Union ability to identify and promote tactical competence, while Confederate promotion policies continued to be influenced by political considerations and personal connections. The battle's tactical lessons influenced military thinking on both sides, particularly regarding the effectiveness of defensive operations in forested terrain. Union officers noted that properly positioned troops behind natural or constructed fortifications could hold superior numbers almost indefinitely, provided they maintained adequate ammunition supplies and communication with higher headquarters. Confederate commanders learned that tactical victory required not only battlefield success but also the logistical capability to exploit initial advantages through sustained offensive operations. As documented in multiple historical sources, including the essential Civil War curriculum, the Battle of Chickamauga ultimately demonstrated both the Confederate Army's continued tactical proficiency and its growing strategic limitations in prosecuting a war against an opponent with superior resources and industrial capacity. The River of Death had claimed over 34,000 American casualties in 2 days of fighting, making Chickamauga the second bloodiest battle in American history. Yet the strategic fruits of this terrible harvest would prove bitter for the Confederate cause, as tactical victory led not to strategic advantage, but to continued Union control of Tennessee's vital transportation networks. The thunder of guns had faded from the Georgia wilderness, but the echoes of Chickamauga would reverberate through American history, marking another step in the Union's relentless march toward final victory in the bloodiest conflict the nation had ever known.